You're flying at 20,000 feet when suddenly an explosive round tears through your cockpit. Glass shreds your face. Blood floods your eyes. Your skull is fractured, you're partially blind, barely conscious, and you're 600 miles from home over open ocean. Most pilots would be dead within minutes. Saburō Sakai flew for 5 hours. This is the story of Japan's most legendary fighter, a man who racked up over 60 for aerial victories, survived wounds that should have killed him 3 times over, and embodied a code of honor so strict that he refused to shoot parachuting enemies even when his own comrades were dying around him, his weapon of choice. The infamous A6M Zero, the fighter plane that terrorized the Pacific skies and became a symbol of Japanese air supremacy. But Saburō Sakai's story isn't just about dogfights and death-defying escapes. It's about what happens when an ancient warrior code collides with modern warfare. It's about the thin line between heroism and survival. And it's about a wound so catastrophic that it would redefine what we thought was humanly possible. To understand Saburō Sakai, you have to go back to 1916, to a small farming village in southern Japan where a boy was born into poverty so severe that his family could barely afford to eat. Sakai wasn't supposed to become a legend. He was supposed to work the fields, maybe learn a trade, and disappear into the anonymous masses of rural Japan. But Sakai had something else: an uncle who had served in the Imperial Japanese Navy and who filled the young boy's head with stories of honor, duty, and the samurai code of bushido. At age 16, Sakai made a decision that would change everything. He enlisted in the Japanese Navy, not as an officer. His family couldn't afford that education, but as an enlisted seaman. The lowest of the low, but he had a plan. The Navy had recently opened its flight training program to enlisted men, and Sakai was determined to become a pilot. Here's what most people do and understand about Japanese naval aviation training in the 1930s. It was designed to break you. Of the 1,500 young men who entered training with Sakai, only 70 graduated. The instructors didn't just want skilled pilots, they wanted warriors who could endure anything, and endure Sakai did. He was beaten for minor infractions, sleep-deprived for days, pushed to physical and mental limits that would make modern military training look soft. But every night, while his fellow trainees collapsed into their bunks, Sakai practiced one more thing: his eyesight training. You see, Sakai had developed a technique. He would stare at distant objects until he could see details that others missed. He would count stars in the night sky, training his eyes to detect movement in the darkness. This wasn't just discipline, this was obsession. And it would save his life more times than he could count. By 1938, Sakai had earned his wings. But he wasn't assigned to a fighter unit, not yet. He flew reconnaissance missions over China, watching from above as the Second Sino-Japanese War unfolded below him. It was boring work, but Sakai was learning something crucial: patience. Then, in 1941, everything changed. When Sakai first laid eyes on the A6M Zero, he knew he was looking at something special. The Zero wasn't just a fighter plane, it was a revolution. At a time when most nations were building heavy, armored aircraft, the Japanese had gone in the opposite direction. The Zero was light, impossibly light. It sacrificed armor and pilot protection for something else: pure performance. And it was beautiful. The Zero could outmaneuver anything in the sky. It could climb faster, turn tighter, and fly farther than any fighter the Allies possessed. In the hands of a skilled pilot like Sakai, it wasn't just a weapon, it was an extension of his body. But here's the dark side of that design philosophy: one good hit could kill you. The Zero had no armor around the cockpit, no self-sealing fuel tanks. American pilots would later call them flying Zippos because they burst into flames so easily. The Japanese designers had made a calculated decision. They believed that offense was the best defense, that a true warrior didn't need armor because he simply wouldn't get hit. Sakai and his fellow pilots were told, "Don't get shot." It was December 1941 when Sakai first saw real combat, flying escort missions over the Philippines as Japan launched its massive offensive across the Pacific. And this is where you start to see Sakai's genius as a fighter pilot. Most pilots, especially young ones, got tunnel vision in combat. They'd lock onto one target and lose all situational awareness. But Sakai had trained his eyes for years. He could track multiple aircraft simultaneously, anticipate their movements, and position himself perfectly for the kill. His first confirmed victory came quickly, an American P-40 that never saw him coming. Then another and another. By the time the Battle of the Philippines was over, Sakai had become an ace. But more than that, he had developed a reputation. His squadron mates noticed something unusual. Sakai never celebrated his kills. He never boasted. He simply did his job with a quiet, almost methodical precision that was both terrifying and inspiring. But war has a way of testing every code, every principle you think you believe in. It was over the jungles of Borneo when Sakai faced a decision that would haunt him and define him for the rest of his life. He had just shot down an Allied bomber, and as was standard procedure in that chaotic stage of the war, he watched the crew bail out. Parachutes blossomed against the green canopy below. And Sakai's wingman, a pilot named Ota, banked hard and dove toward them, guns blazing. Sakai watched in horror as his comrades strafed the defenseless men in their parachutes. Over the radio, Sakai's voice cut through. "What are you doing?" Oda's response was matter of fact, "They're the enemy. They'll just fight us again tomorrow." It was true. It was logical. It was also, in Sakai's mind, deeply wrong. You have to understand something about the samurai code that Sakai had internalized since childhood. Bushido wasn't just about fighting, it was about honor. And there was no honor in killing a defenseless man. A warrior fought warriors. The moment an enemy was helpless, he was no longer your enemy, he was simply a man. From that moment on, Sakai made a private vow. He would never shoot a parachuting enemy. Never. This wasn't just idealism. Other Japanese pilots who followed similar codes often paid for it with their lives. But Sakai believed something that sounds almost naive now, that even in the midst of total war, there were lines that separated men from monsters. His victories mounted, 10 confirmed kills, 20, 30. By mid-1942, Sakai was becoming one of Japan's most celebrated aces, and he was doing it while flying with a code of honor that many of his peers had abandoned. But the Pacific War was about to take a darker turn, and Sakai's beliefs and his body were about to be tested in ways that no one could have imagined. August 7, 1942, the Americans have just invaded Guadalcanal and everything is about to change. Up until this point, Japan had been winning. Their pilots were more experienced, their tactics superior, their aircraft untouchable. But Guadalcanal was different. The Americans were learning, adapting, and they had numbers, endless numbers. Sakai and his squadron were flying from Rabaul, over 500 miles away, an exhausting distance that pushed even the Zero's legendary range to its limits. They were flying multiple missions a day, barely sleeping, living on rice and whatever they could scavenge. And then came August 7th, Sakai was flying top cover over Guadalcanal when he spotted them, a formation of 8 aircraft in tight formation, perfect formation to perfect. His instincts screamed at him something was wrong, but he was exhausted. He'd been flying for weeks with minimal rest. And those aircraft looked like easy targets, slow, vulnerable bombers from his angle. Sakai made the decision to attack. It was the biggest mistake of his life. As he closed in, the bombers suddenly broke formation. They weren't bombers at all, they were American SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and their rear gunners had been waiting for someone stupid enough to attack from behind. 7.30 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The bullet entered through Sakai's windscreen at an angle, and everything happened in an instant that seemed to last forever. First came the glass. The exploding windscreen sent fragments tearing into his face and skull. Then the bullet itself, it struck him in the head, fragmenting as it went, tearing through muscle and bone. His right eye was instantly destroyed, his skull fractured. Blood poured down his face so thick that he couldn't see. The Zero went into a violent spin. Sakai's first conscious thought wasn't fear, it was anger. Anger at himself for making such a stupid mistake. Anger that he was going to die 600 miles from home because he'd been too tired to trust his instincts. But then something else kicked in, something primal. He wasn't dead yet. Through his one remaining eye, swimming in blood and pain, Sakai could see the altimeter spinning. He was falling. Fast, the ocean was rushing up at him. But somehow his hands still worked. He pulled. The Zero shuddered. Metal screamed. But the plane came out of the spin. Now came the hard part, surviving the next 5 hours. Sakai couldn't see out of his right eye. His left eye was barely functional, flooded with blood. Every movement sent lightning bolts of pain through his shattered skull. And he had no idea if he was even flying in the right direction, but he had trained for this. Not for this exact scenario. No one trains to fly with a fractured skull and destroyed eye, but he had trained his mind to function through pain, through exhaustion, through conditions that would make other men simply give up. He wiped the blood from his left eye, checked his compass, adjusted his heading. The Pacific Ocean stretched out endlessly below him. Here's what makes Sakai's survival even more remarkable. He was actively dying. The human body isn't designed to function with that level of head trauma. His brain was swelling. Blood was pooling in places it shouldn't be. He was slipping in and out of consciousness. But every time the darkness pulled at him, Sakai would do anything to stay awake. He would slap himself, bite his tongue, scream into the roar of the engine. One account says he even pounded his head against the cockpit frame just to stay conscious. Think about that for a second. A man with a fractured skull deliberately causing himself more pain just to avoid blacking out. After 3 hours, Sakai saw land, but it wasn't Rabaul. He had drifted off course. He was over enemy territory. If he bailed out now, he'd be captured or killed. So he kept flying. For hours, his fuel was running critically low. His vision was deteriorating, but through his one functioning eye, he finally saw it, Rabaul. By the time Sakai landed his Zero, he was flying almost entirely on instinct. The wheels touched down, the plane rolled to a stop. Sakai tried to climb out of the cockpit and collapsed. When his fellow pilots reached him, they thought he was already dead. His face was a mask of blood. One eye was completely destroyed, hanging from the socket. His skull was visibly fractured. Sakai had just flown for 5 hours with injuries that would have incapacitated any normal human being within minutes. But he wasn't done yet. The field hospital at Rabaul wasn't equipped for the kind of injuries Sakai had sustained. They did what they could, cleaned the wounds, removed the destroyed eye, tried to stabilize the skull fracture. But they expected him to die within days. Sakai refused. He spent 2 months in that hospital, hovering between life and death, racked with fevers and infections that should have killed him. The right side of his face was permanently paralyzed. He had lost all vision in one eye, and the other had been damaged by the trauma. By any reasonable standard, his flying days were over. Except Sakai didn't believe in reasonable standards. Against all medical advice, against common sense, against the protests of his doctors and commanding officers, Sakai began training himself to fly again with one eye, with a paralyzed face. With a skull that had been literally fractured, he started small. He would walk to the flight line and just sit in a Zero's cockpit, reeling the controls by feel. Then he progressed to taxiing, then brief hops down the runway. His depth perception was gone, his peripheral vision was compromised. But Sakai had spent years training his eyesight, and now he adapted. He learned to judge distances by relative sizes, to compensate for his blind spot by constantly moving his head. to fly using instincts he had developed over thousands of hours in the air. By early 1943, incredibly, impossibly, Sakai was cleared to return to combat. But the war he returned to was different. Japan was no longer winning. The tide had turned at Midway and Guadalcanal. American pilots were no longer inexperienced rookies, they were hardened veterans flying new aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat that could match the Zero in a fight. And Sakai, he was flying with one eye, reduced physical capabilities, and chronic pain that never went away. Yet he continued to score victories, not as many as before his ace days were behind him, but enough to prove that even a broken Sakai was more dangerous than most pilots at full strength. By 1944, everything that Sakai had believed about bushido and honorable combat was being ground to dust. Japan was losing badly. The carefully trained pilots who had started the war, men like Sakai, who had spent years honing their skills, were almost all dead. They'd been replaced by boys, teenagers with minimal training, sent up to die in machines they barely knew how to fly. Sakai watched as the kamikaze program began. Young pilots, some as young as 17, deliberately crashing their planes into American ships. It was called honor. It was called duty. Sakai called it murder. He had spent his entire military career adhering to a code of conduct that said a warrior's life had value, that honor meant fighting with skill and courage, not throwing yourself away in a final desperate gesture. But who was he to question? He was just a pilot, an enlisted man who had survived far longer than he should have. The final years of the war were a blur of retreat and desperation. Sakai was eventually stationed in Japan itself, helping to train new pilots and defending the home islands against American bombing raids. He flew his last combat mission in 1945, shooting down an American B-29 over Tokyo. When the war ended on August 15, 1945, Saburō Sakai had officially recorded 60 for aerial victories, though the actual number was likely higher. He had survived wounds that should have killed him. He had flown through an entire war while maintaining a code of honor that most people would consider suicidal. And now, at age 28, he was alive in a defeated nation that didn't know what to do with men like him. Here's the thing about Saburō Sakai that makes his story truly remarkable: what he did after the war. Many veteran aces struggled with civilian life. Some couldn't let go of the glory days. Others were consumed by survivors' guilt or bitterness about the defeat. Sakai could have become any of those things. Instead, he became something unexpected, a voice for reconciliation. Sakai wrote a memoir that became a bestseller in Japan and eventually in America. He corresponded with former enemies, including American pilots he had fought against. He gave talks about the war, but always with a message of peace and the futility of conflict. In one famous incident, Sakai met Harold Jones, an American rear gunner who had been on one of the planes Sakai had attacked. Instead of hostility, they became friends. Sakai told Jones, "We were both doing our duty. The war is over. Now we are just men." He lived to be 84 years old, dying in 2000 after suffering a heart attack at a veterans reunion. He spent his final decades working as a Buddhist acolyte and speaking out against war. The samurai who had survived the unsurvivable, who had killed 64 men in aerial combat, who had refused to compromise his honor even when it cost him, spent his final years advocating for peace. Saburō Sakai's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Can a man be honorable in a dishonorable war? Is there such a thing as a good warrior when the cause is unjust? And what does it mean to survive when so many others didn't? Sakai never claimed to have the answers. He simply lived according to a code he believed in, even when that code seemed obsolete, even when it would have been easier to abandon it. That flight back to Rabaul 5 hours with a shattered skull and destroyed eye, it wasn't just physical endurance. It was a manifestation of everything Sakai believed. That a warrior doesn't give up, that duty means something even when you're dying. That the measure of a man isn't just what he does when he's strong, but what he refuses to become when he's broken. The Zero fighters are long gone, scrapped or rusting in jungles across the Pacific. The pilots who flew them, most of them are gone too. But Saburō Sakai's story remains, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, individuals can still choose who they want to be. He was the samurai of the sky, and his code, tested in fire and blood, survived longer than the empire he served.